I'm so excited to give this presentation on how data can make the Native vote a swing vote and using data to empower, mobilize, and tell our story. First, I'll introduce myself and Tlingit. Jendukla yuchatu asak yethnach hasadi klinedi ayahat ankhat hit dakhayahat bushkitan yeti. My Tlingit name is Jendukla. I'm of the Raven Moiety and the Dog Salmon Clan Klinedi. I'd like to acknowledge my father's people, the Wushkitan, the Eagle Shark Clan. I'd like to acknowledge all of my own elected leaders here. It's always an honor to work in the Alaska Caucus, so I'm glad to see everyone here today. Let's see, to advance. Here we go. We have our Native Vote initiative that I want to describe a little bit to you today, some of the goals and the ways that data is a really critical part of this effort. But first, I also want to acknowledge many of the elected and appointed leaders in the room that are working outside of tribal government and mainstream governments in the American political system. We see a rising tide of Native leaders in running for Congress and for state and local offices that are really inspiring. My friend Pankawee gave the welcome yesterday, and she was one of the Miss NCAIs actually, and she and her mother welcomed me to my first NCAI conference, so it's really inspiring to see young people go on to move into higher elective office based on their experiences at NCAI. We are also seeing historic races, the Idaho governor primary where Paulette Jordan won, and then we also have a primary today in New Mexico and a number of other states where Deb Haaland is running. Never had a Native American woman in Congress, so we are in a really exciting time, I think, when it comes to Native vote. The goals overall of our Native vote effort are first to support Native vote coordinators at the grassroots level. Second, we want to help increase the political participation of Native people. That includes education, registration, and turnout. But ultimately, we want to create a strong and permanent infrastructure for civic engagement. We have issues where we get mobilized for one election and then our infrastructure sort of falls apart or is a little bit less maintained for the next cycles, and we have to rebuild everything. So we want to create a permanent infrastructure, including data efforts. One of the reasons we're highlighting this on the plenary session is because it is at the confluence of data and changing policy. Everyone here knows what's most important at the local level. We have done analysis at the national level about how Native vote can play a critical role in congressional races, in the Senate races, and governor races. But really what's going to motivate voters to come out to vote in Native communities is understanding why issues are important at the local level and making those connections between what's important for our people and citizens and communities and the impact that, besides tribal elections, how elections at the state and federal level also impact our issues. So that's the education component. And actually, it was yesterday in our Native vote training, Travis Lane, one of our superstar Native vote coordinators, made this point, how everything needs to be made local for actually turning out Native voters. So in this photo, one of our relatives from Alaska is writing in why it's important to vote and why they're voting. They're writing, "Our Native ways of living are important to me and my family." So at the same time, making sure that people understand the local importance, but then also connecting that to the federal elections. So the importance of representation, we talk about, many times we've been deliberately shut out of power. We talk a lot about governmental parity, but this effort with Native vote is also about political parity. We have different ways of changing policy. In addition to the government-to-government diplomacy that we engage in all the time through consultations, as dual citizens, it's important to engage as citizens of our state and local and federal governments. And that's sometimes where we've had an issue engaging in the American political system, whether due to mistrust or deliberate attempts to prevent us from participating in those political systems. One other thing I wanted to highlight is how we're civically engaged as tribal people. And civic engagement is simply for fulfilling your role as a citizen. This used to be for us knowing our protocol, hunting, fishing, ceremonies, living our values of respect for yourself, others, and property, working together, having discipline. Now civic engagement includes engaging in non-tribal governments as well. I included this image from the Center for Native American Youth, their Native Youth Report, the theme of which was really relevant to our Native Vote effort, which is our identities as civic power. And I think the image conveys, staying true to our roots and our traditions and culture, but you see she's wearing headphones as well. And using technology to advance our interests, it doesn't mean that we are moving away from our traditions and culture and who we are. It's adding to who we are and being who we are in different realms. So civically engaging does not have to negate who we are as people grounded in our cultures and values. Standing up together is civic power, who we are. So this continuum, I just want to delve into a little bit more. We're working to build strong tribal nations through NCAI's work in advocacy and internal governance improvements. Then we're also, engaging in diplomacy and advocacy, engaging in direct action through demonstrations and marches, and then last, on the other side of the continuum, engaging in voting in non-tribal governments through our votes and supplying candidates. Ultimately, the goal is to have the United States live up to its promises, both the treaties and agreements with our tribes, but also the ideals that are in America's Constitution, that we're all created equal, promises that were not met the first day America was born. So we're, as I said, at a pivotal point where we're overcoming barriers to voting, and there's a lot of really great work being done for voter protection. In Nevada, the Pyramid Lake and Walker River Paiutes just won a lawsuit that charged tribal citizens had to travel really long distances to vote, and the suit has forced officials to open more polling stations. This is a really big win. And in Alaska, we've had some advances as well in overcoming barriers to voting, but at the same time that we're doing voter protection and making sure we have access to polls, it's also important to make the case to our communities about turnout and registration, engaging in the American political system in addition to our own. At the same time, though, we see sometimes backlash against our successes. As I mentioned, as peoples, we have been intentionally shut out of power for a long time, both as Native people and women and minorities. Lots of marginalized groups have intentionally been shut out, and so we have to do extra work to register and do the turnout efforts around that. So how are we doing with supplying policymakers in Congress and Senate and state legislatures? We have a growing population who has diverse needs, and you can see on the left here the increase in the American Indian Alaska Native population from 1990 to 2010. So we have a fast-growing population with incredible needs across the states and regions, but our elected representation in the US government is pretty lacking. In the Senate, 0 American Indians in the Senate right now. Proportional, if we had proportional representation in the Senate, we would have 2 American Indian senators. If we had proportional representation in the House, we would have 7 American Indian members of Congress. Right now we have 2. So we're working on supplying members, supplying decision makers who understand our issues. That's really important and exciting to watch happen. Turning to the state legislature and Native representation in there is also really interesting. How are we doing with tribal representatives in our state legislatures? And I have to acknowledge the great work of Mark Trehant, who's collected these data sets and collected the names, crowdsourced data set. He shares his Google spreadsheets, makes it publicly available. And so I looked at his data set and did a similar analysis of what is proportional representation in many of these state legislatures. Here we see the members of, this is Alaska through Montana in alphabetical order, just so you can see a little bit, hopefully you can. The numbers of Native state legislators in the state house or the state senate, upper or lower chamber, however they're called in the respective states. In Alaska, we have 8 elected in 2016, in Montana 9, in Minnesota 4, in Kansas 1, Idaho 1, and then if you look at what would be proportional representation in state legislatures, you look at, it's a simple calculation where you look at the population of Native population as a proportion of the state, and then look at the size of the state legislature. What would be that similar proportion? Just because this was a question asked in our Native vote training. You would have 12 state legislators in Alaska, you would have 12 in Montana, and you would have 1 more in Arizona, you would have 3 more in Kansas. So what is proper representation, we're not quite there yet. But we have made a lot of progress in doing historical analysis of previous state legislatures. I'm sure we would see an uptick. This is also related to how the district lines are drawn. In Montana, the previous redistricting cycle, we had favorable lines drawn so that there would be better representation by Native people, and that's a really critical part of the 2018 elections because I can't remember the exact number, but the state legislators who are elected in 2018 and the members of Congress, or the governors, I should say, will have a really major role in the 2020 redistricting process. And this is not just redistricting of Congress and drawing those lines in apportionment, but it also draws the lines for state legislative districts. And if you have favorable lines drawn for state legislative districts, it's easier to rectify the disparity in representation. I also did this for New Mexico through Wyoming, and these are just states with larger Native American populations. 8 legislators in New Mexico, 9 in Oklahoma, 4 in Washington, 3 in South Dakota, 2 in North Dakota. Proportional representation in these state legislatures would have 3 more in New Mexico, many more in North Dakota, 8 more in North Dakota. There's a pretty stark difference in proper or proportional representation there. Oklahoma would have 10 more. South Dakota also has a ways to go. So this would be about having people in place who understand our issues, not just as voters, but as the decision makers. So I would definitely want to thank Mark for providing this information for us to look at and monitor the trends. It's really exciting to watch this unfold. And we have a lot more Native legislators running for state legislatures, or candidates, I should say, with changes in the gender representation as well. So if you look at this just from proportional representation, these are the number of Native people needed for proportional representation just in order. And you can see Oklahoma has a need for 10 more. This includes both that upper and lower chamber. North and South Dakota would need 8 more. Alaska would need 4 more. And then California through Wisconsin needing 3. Hawaii they are overrepresented of Native Hawaiians, which is actually good. It would be great to see that for all of the states. Another trend that we're looking at, this is broader than Indian country, but if you look at the trend in the primaries so far, this is congressional races. 43% is the share of female nominees of a major party so far in 2018, a record high. This is a story that's not getting written about too much, but it's being monitored by some of the data journalists that I follow, and it's just a really interesting dynamic. And if you look at districts with no incumbent women, the ratio is actually, the proportion is actually more than 50% women running for Congress. This is the highest share ever, more than 50%. That's pretty incredible. That is if the trend is sustained through the remaining 2/3 of the primary calendar. The last record was 29% in 2016. So a reason why it's important to field candidates is that and research that's been conducted about the prospects of women and men running, there's really no difference in the success rate if a woman runs for office versus a man running for office. It's really whether somebody takes the initiative to run for office. I haven't seen research on this for Native candidates, but it can't hurt to run. You won't know if it's a more difficult hill to climb or not if you don't try. So this is really encouraging to see. There are a number of articles that Mark has written too about Native legislator gender breakdown. So I was curious about the proportion of men and women as legislators. These are in the state legislatures. In 2016, the elected legislators had 37 men and 25 women, which makes up a 40% proportion. And that's actually better than the ratio or the proportion of women in Congress, which was less than 30%. And if you look at the 2018 candidate breakdown, it's a very similar breaking even now, 51 men and 49 women running for state legislatures. And if you look at the change over 2016, obviously these candidates haven't won yet, and they might be running against each other, but still, this is a pretty tremendous increase in both the number of candidates for men and women compared to 2016. If everyone were to be elected, that would be a 38% increase for men and a 96% increase if Native women got into state legislatures. That would be doubling the number of women in state legislatures compared to 2016. So another way to analyze our data for political representation is looking at the races where the Native vote can really make a difference. And this is really important for the makeup of Congress and the House and Senate and governor races. The sources and methodology I used for this analysis was looking at the Cook Political Report. They make race ratings. They announce toss-up races based on their analysis. They look at lean districts and likely districts. So the way we looked at this is converted it from lean Democrat or lean Republican and classified it as competitive. That way we don't appear as partisan. But from their analysis, if you look at the competitive Senate races, there are 2 toss-up races with the native population over 5%. And that is the North Dakota Senate race and the Arizona Senate race. If you include the lean districts, there's Minnesota, and then if you look at the potentially competitive districts, Montana, Wisconsin, and Nebraska all have Native voter populations. 3 competitive races if you look at it that way. If you look at, this is just the map of the same information, toss-up races, competitive races, and potentially competitive races. And we released this analysis at our Executive Council winter session. It's online at our Native Vote website. And like I mentioned before, for organizing and turning out the Native vote, it's really important to make these larger scale trends important at the local level. But it's more for a perspective at the tribal leader level and executive level to understand where Congress is going, or where it could go, where the Native vote could make a huge difference. Similarly, with the House of Representatives, there are, these are the competitive House races on the D side, and including the Republican competitive races, there are 32 competitive congressional races with Native voting age populations over 1.5%. That threshold is a little bit low, but if you look at how close many of the races have been over the last cycle, you have elections in Virginia that were tied and decided by a coin flip. Many of these races are going to be very, very close, so even though we might just be 1.5% of a congressional district population, it's still important that candidates understand what our issues are, because if they see that we turn out to vote in our voting block, it'll make it much easier for our issues to be heard if they get elected to Congress. If we go back one, the toss-up races on the D side are Minnesota Congressional District 8. The competitive races are Arizona 1 and 2, California 39, and Nevada 3. Also likely or potentially competitive races in Arizona, Minnesota, and Nevada. On the R side, there are a number of toss-up races in California, Washington, and Colorado with native voting age population over 1.5%, and competitive districts in North Carolina, Kansas, Maine, Utah, and Virginia. There's actually a number of native voters in Virginia. And then potentially competitive in Montana, Michigan, Wisconsin, and Arizona and Texas. So this is more for informing where you might be able to get more traction in holding candidate forums and making the issues that are important to your tribes and communities and people salient to these candidates who need to find voters that they can appeal to. Another resource that I wanted to share, Data for Changing Policy, is this interactive map that we uploaded the same information that I just described the methodology for, and added that overlaid reservation boundaries and the American Indian Alaska Native population by congressional districts. So then you can drill down and find information about the number of American Indian people 18 and over in a particular congressional district, its district rating, and then the total population 18 and over, so you can get the percentage. So this is for targeting resources throughout a state. If you're a nonprofit or looking to coordinate and organize your Native vote coordinators across a larger region, this is to assist as a tool for that. One thing that we want to note is that we're seeing, like I mentioned before, there's been some backlash against success in various populations. And I think it's been mentioned already, there's been news reports about a congressional candidate calling for ending tribal reservations. There's some opposition to tribal sovereignty. And there's another rising trend that's, I'm sure we're all aware of it, but the rise of white nationalism. At least 8 people associated with white nationalist groups are running for office this year, according to the Southern Poverty Law Center. One quote I heard in an article I just read is, for some of these, it's hard for erstwhile hegemony to feel happy about their fall. And I think that as there are more equitable outcomes politically, we might see a little bit more backlash. So data for organizing is the last thing I want to talk about. And I worked with Travis at ICCA, and we're really seeking out the data experts for understanding the voter file and cutting turf and getting the names and numbers for doing the voter registration and turnout. So this kind of information is actually kind of difficult to get for various states. But in Arizona, we worked with one of the data guys that's in one of their state tables, and they're able to give the number of eligible voters. And in Arizona, the model they use for getting this data is based on precincts where there are large Native populations combined with a model that estimates race, and it seems to be pretty accurate. It's different for different states. Some states don't have this good modeling capability, but it's always good to find the state tables, whether you work with state voices or other vendors, to get information about what's happening in your region so that you can get the voter information for your own population. In Arizona, like I said, 209,000 eligible voters according to their model, 106,000 registered, and in 2016, the voter turnout was 55,000 compared to 2014, 36,000, but that's just the difference between a presidential election and a midterm election generally. So working with state tables and data experts is highly recommended, and trust is a major issue with that. But it would be good if we would encourage working with experts in your state or with us, and we've been having conversations about how to do that. There's the national estimate that 66% of Native people are not registered or are registered. So the remaining that means 1 million Native people are not registered. Finding where that million Native people are, we know in some of our smaller communities exactly who they are, probably, but if we're working with our citizens who are more mobile, or people who have moved to a city, or young people who have moved off to college, helping them understand how to get registered. There's a lot of loose connections that we have with some of our members, and that's where some of this data can really come in handy for tribal governments and some of our nonprofits and Native vote coordinators. If you look at a graph of the Arizona analysis, this is the kind of information that is really important for sharing with fundraisers. We're actively looking for resources to provide, sub-grants, possibly, depending on which funders come through, but they have basic questions about how many people are registered, can you register, how many can you turn out? And these basic statistics are critical for communicating with funders who want to invest in Indian country, but don't know how their resources would be used. So, how many more people can be turned out to vote? You need some of this basic information preferably at all levels of geography, state level, national level, regional, and tribal if possible, or a city or congressional district. So we have some of that, but it really depends on the state and the capacity of the region and the tribes. So last is analyzing and messaging turnout information. We collected a little bit working with some of our coordinators in 2012 and 2016, and you can do analysis across regions, across counties, across tribes, across states, or compared to the non-tribal voting population. And just for tracking metrics of our success, this is really critical, again, for finding resources to fund our work and for understanding our engagement of our own people in non-tribal elections. Other states have been really good. And Montana has a really high tribal turnout rate compared to some of the other regions. And I think it reflects an investment and it reflects a move of civic engagement ethic or attitude. And I'm always impressed with their turnout and for tribal precincts in Montana. As high as 70% in Blaine County for tribal precincts. That's really high. So another final thing I want to touch on is working with the Native vote coordinators and tribes about how to communicate what happened and tell our story after an election has happened, leading up to an election. And visuals are always helpful for me and for a lot of lay people. So we want to work with tribes and regions and the Native Vote Coordinator Network to tell our story with the data that we have after an election. And we want to do that in coordination. So Whitney, who's here and is doing a wonderful job leading the Native Vote effort, she is looking for new Native Vote coordinators for tribes who haven't appointed one. And the work that we're doing and the technical assistance, we want to bring people together to share knowledge and lessons learned and develop some of the messaging outreach, social media outreach, toolkits, and some of our goals that we set yesterday in our Native Vote breakout were incredible, but sharing that information and knowledge is what Whitney's leading. So in coordination with the Native Vote coordinators, we want to work with, analyzing the results of elections. We did this after the presidential election, but it's always good to do for important races across the board. And for this visual, this is Alaska, the percent Alaska Native. The red is over 65%, and that's the northern and western rural part of the state. And then the blue is 0 to 12%. This is where Alaska Native people live by tract. It's census data. And then it's very easy to overlay the results of elections. And as an indicator of political representation and the role that the Native vote played, this is the 2010 Senate election. The green is where there was a write-in response of over 55%. And then you can see throughout the state if, the Native population and then the write-in campaign results is very clearly attributable to the turnout in rural areas of Alaska. This has been incredible for working with Senator Murkowski. She knows what happened in the election. The second write-in campaign, successful write-in campaign for Senate was mostly due to Alaska Native voters, which is incredible. So we want to have similar sorts of wins like that, not wins, but successes where a policymaker knows how important our issues are because we turned out to vote. One of our other resources is this is not NCAI is nonpartisan, and both parties have misunderstood tribal sovereignty. Both parties at different times have suppressed the voices and votes of tribal citizens. So as NCAI, we steer clear of partisan statements, but we do call for good policy no matter what the party. As Jefferson says, I for Indian. It's critical that policymakers see the importance of the Native vote, though. And so this is just an infographic that summarizes some of the successes of members of Congress who see the importance of Native vote. And in Montana, Senator Tester won his election by 3,000 votes. Over 17,000 votes were cast from reservation areas. Similar with, so I already reviewed the Senator Murkowski race, but the final pitch I have is all data has value, especially accurate data about people. Look at how data on people owned by Facebook is used by businesses and to sell you things or to affect elections. But having accurate data about our populations is really difficult to get. And one of the things that tribes can do in improving data in the voter file is you can match your tribal lists to the voter file through state voices and various state tables so that you can have a record of voting propensity. Our data is very valuable and sacred. It's information about our people. But if you have the correct sort of agreements in place with the data experts who work in these state tables, you can craft a really good outreach and mobilization campaign that mobilizes, engages Native voters. So that is all of the data that I have, but I was just struck. I was scrolling through one of the GOTV Facebook pages, and I love this pin, is Get Out the Native Vote in Alaska. And somebody, might not be able to read it, but someone says, how do I get one of those pins? And somebody else says, when I registered to vote at South Central Foundation in the lobby when I got a flu shot. So using the places where we congregate, basketball games, health centers, where people feel safe, that's where we can reach the most vulnerable people who maybe not have already registered or might not be engaged in politics. But we are really excited about Native Vote and the way data can empower our communities. So with that, I think I will conclude and we can move into the discussion part.